Welcome to Ancient Geeks, a podcast about two geeks at a certain age looking back with fondness on our earlier selves when we first discovered the different elements of geek culture, such as our topic today, and we flash forward in time to the future or the present when we look back and also reevaluate a lot of what we've been reading or watching or playing all our lives. We were geek before it was chic. I'm your co-host, the sickly albino, Tom Grant.
And I'm your co-host, Stephen Call Me Moonglum Taylor.
There we go. The eternal companion.
Yes.
All right. So I actually am sickly today. So if listeners, you're worried about me, all I have is a cold. But I have my herbs and potions and poultices to keep me going. And you got to have a good poultice. I mean, that's
Absolutely
just essential. All right. So before we get into our topic of today, Elric of Melniboné, what have you been doing lately that's geek related, Stephen?
So I think the only other geek thing is, watching Strange New Worlds, which has been on, and I did start some movie watching for some future podcasts, as well as just finally consuming all the Elric that I needed to consume for this podcast.
And thank you for soldiering through.
No, I
all
appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Okay. So I also been watching Strange New Worlds, dragging myself towards the finish line of this season. I also started reading the recent Eternals series. Now, I haven't seen the Eternals movie, but certainly the Eternals and the Celestials are a big part of the Marvel universe now, both on screen and
Oh, yes.
in the comics. And so I was curious. Just I saw the art of Esad Ribic or Ribic. I don't know how you pronounce his name.
I'm unfamiliar.
Anyway, it's really terrific.
Okay.
It's sort of almost like Art Nouveau-ish
Interesting.
in tone. And anyway, the Eternals were kind of a weird title that Jack Kirby started in the 70s when he came back to Marvel. I was never a big fan, but I was also then a little bit surprised that those characters became so essential to the Marvel universe. So anyway, I'm enjoying reading that right now.
Excellent.
Okay, so before we get into our discussion of Elric, what music would you choose for this episode if we could afford a soundtrack?
So at first I was out to see about this, no pun intended. And I realized that Soul Man by Sam and Dave works. And the lyrics fit better than you might think.
Soul Sucking Man?
That's right.
Okay. All right. I chose from the rock group Hawkwind. Probably their best known song is "Hurry Down Sundown," but they're a very prog rock group, and there's a Moorcock connection with them. So I chose "The Wizard Blew His Horn" from the album "The Warrior at the Edge of Time." There's actually an album that they did called "The Chronicle of the Black Sword," which is pretty much spot on. And then maybe if you're not a fan of more obscure prog rock, more well-known prog rock from the 70s, I would choose "In the Court of the Crimson King" by King Crimson.
There you go.
So many ideas for soundtracks. Okay, so before we get into the background, how would you characterize this series? Like if you had a word or two words, like what would you say about it?
So I should have thought more about this. I saw the question. In a word or two, I'm bad at these word or two things. It's my academic background. Can't speak a word or two, but pulpy comes to mind to some degree. Magical works. And it is the tale of an anti-hero works too. That's more than two words, but
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, I have a struggle trying to come up with a one word description of this. I mean, it's certainly different. Right? It doesn't feel like other fantasy. Even sword and sorcery. I mean, there's a lot of sword and sorcery elements in it. But it's also a lot more gonzo than
yeah, I mean,
some of those. Or
I don't, and we talked about this offline a few days ago, and I really have yet to figure out what it is it's tickling in my brain. Part of it definitely feels different in sort of in the nature of the character, the main character, and some of the well aspects of who he is and what he does. But but part of it does feel familiar to me. And I don't know if it's
Hmm.
Conan stories that it reminds me of. It's something about adventure, character driven, character focused, sort of questing kinds of stories.
Hmm.
And so it didn't feel thoroughly unique to me in that sense. There are elements of it that are unique, but that wasn't now, granted, I think this is again, we didn't really say this necessarily. Let's lay it on the table. This is something you read much earlier in life, and I
Oh yeah.
read over the last, however many weeks it's been now since I finally started reading this stuff. So this is entirely new to me. I was aware of the character as we discussed in the D&D episode. It's still stuck in my mind. This friend from middle school who called him Elric of Melniboné. So, I had to like reprogram my brain on that one.
Mel in the bone.
Mel in the bone. And and I knew about Stormbringer and I knew the real basics, but I didn't know anything about the narrative at all. So I'm coming at this with, having 50-ish years of, from when I first started reading and encountering genre stuff in my head, rather than it being
Right.
something that I encountered as a middle schooler, where it might have been much more unique to me. So there's something about it that I can't quite put my finger on. I think the reason I picked pulpy is because it became quite evident to me in reading the stories that it was obviously written for magazines, so it has this more episodic feel to it,
Hmm.
and it's so I want to be clear. I enjoyed this, and I want to read more of stuff written by Moorcock in this universe and perhaps elsewhere. But I'm not as enchanted with it, I think, as you are, to pick a word that might be also a bit of a pun. But
Okay.
I I find it there's so much that I liked about it, but I wanted more than what I got from
Okay.
the books, the
Yeah,
stories.
I definitely encountered it 50 years ago.
Right,
And it was the Daw paperbacks,
right,
which had the terrific Michael Whelan covers. Since I'm very high on fantasy and science fiction art these days. In fact, I bought a new book that's sitting over on the bookshelf here. That's a compendium of different artists. But anyway, they're these incredibly visually striking covers. They suck me
hmm
in. And at the time, talk about familiarity. I had read a couple of maybe the Conan stories
right,
at that younger age. I hadn't really read. I mean, the paperbacks were around, so I'll revise. I read probably a couple of the Conan books that had the pure Robert E. Howard stories, and
right,
then the pastiches done by L. Sprague de Camp.
hmm
Um, so, and like a little bit of Fafford and the Grey Mounser, and
right,
so I was very familiar at that point with Sword and Sorcery, particularly because of the Conan comic that Marvel Comics had published. So you're right. I mean, there's this very episodic feel to a lot of the Elric stories, but also it's kind of a little bit, not, there's a longer story arc in there. And I
right,
think that was unusual a little bit at the time to have both the episodic elements and the long story arc elements a la Babylon 5
right.
or Deep Space Nine when the Dominion War kicked off.
I maybe if we're gonna pick a word and make up a word, um, D&D-ish is what came to mind, and I
Interesting.
understand that D&D is after this, and D&D is influenced by this.
Hmm.
But it just because of the sort of questing nature of so many of the stories,
Yeah,
where you start off in a town, you encounter something you need to go find, you fight and defeat the big villain by the end of the
right.
story, and then you acquire the thing you needed, whatever that may be. It
Or not
it
sometimes.
or not,
Yeah,
right? But it and a lot of it, it felt like in a D&D module, there's just these things that the dungeon master is going to throw at you that you have to deal with, and often they are quite convenient in terms of the way in which they serve the story.
right. And the thing too, I want to also maybe go back to one word, which is I said different. I mean, certainly imaginative. So
Sure. Oh
like
yeah.
the thing that's thrown at you isn't, your bog standard troll or dragon or whatever. I mean, these are really very different sorts of antagonists and allies and magic items and whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So a little background on Michael Moorcock, the author of this series. So he's a British writer still alive who was one of the critical parts of the new wave science fiction movement in science fiction fantasy, I should say, starting in the 1960s. So other names: Christopher Priest, Brian Aldiss, John Brunner, other important pillars of this movement. This was an attempt to try to take science fiction, which was often kind of very focused on extraordinary people, and certain kinds of far future sort of stories, and bring them a little closer to home, both in terms of who the characters are and a lot of the kind of a lot of the storylines. So, for example, there's one of these authors wrote a book, High Rise, that's about a high-rise apartment building in Britain, and things kind of start going crazy. Kind of the little micro society of the high-rise building starts flying apart. Um, but anyway, so this was a reaction to a lot of the science fiction that existed at the time. I don't know if I'm doing it justice to kind of give you a very short summary of it, but it was very distinctive. I mean, if you read a book by somebody who was in the new wave, there are other authors you might want to throw in who were not necessarily explicitly part of the new wave, that the circle of British writers, but like Joanna Russ and others, you could really kind of tell the intent.
Wouldn't you put Zelazny in the new wave?
Could be, yeah, yeah. I think that's fair. Um, Zelazny's protagonists are all more or less Humphrey Bogart. um, they're some of they certainly occupy, in many cases, occupy high positions of power, like Corwin did in the
Hmm.
Amber books. But often there was a sort of like a tone of these are sort of people who were kind of reacting more to events than being the big drivers of events. They're really smart, but anyway, there's a whole vibe to this, and you know, Moorcock was important because he was an editor aside from
Hmm.
a writer. And so he went out to go find people to contribute to this new wave movement in science fiction. And he was also reacting, when he started writing fantasy, to J.R.R. Tolkien. There's a famous essay that Moorcock wrote about why you should not like J.R.R. Tolkien, basically.
Yes,
Um,
I
and
read
it
it
was,
yesterday.
oh, okay, good.
Epic poo.
Epic poo. That's right. That's right. Epic poo. Is there like a one-line summary you have since you just read it? I remember it, but I think you're fresher than I am.
So, one line. You keep challenging me on this,
Well, don't take
requiring
just
brevity.
one line.
I'm
I'm being a
teasing.
little
I'm
bit of a
teasing.
putz there.
I'm teasing. I think the essay "Epic Poo," which was originally written in 1978 and then was edited, I think, for another volume and updated in the 80s, is it's a somewhat literary, also somewhat political critique of people like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, A. Milne, hence the poo part. It's not poo. It's, of course, it's a play on words, but it's Pooh Bear is what he's talking about. It's this
Right.
idea that there's a certain genre of especially British fiction that is comfort food and wants you to be comfortable, and he criticizes these writers for being overly focused on sort of like making people feel warm and comfortable, warm and cozy. I think he
Hmm.
critiques at one point, and it's also a political critique because he thinks that these are all basically anti-urbanist writers who are overly romanticizing the countryside, and that's the Shire is a safe place, and cities are evil, and
It's a proper place.
yeah, at the proper place. So,
Yeah.
and I think some of it's interesting. I think his political commentary in the essay has some some truth to it. I mean, clearly, people like Tolkien and Lewis were of a conservative bent in a British sense. And I thought his literary criticism in it's kind of weak in that it basically
Hmm.
says these people aren't good writers. Here's a passage. See, they're not good writers, but he never says really why, in my opinion. except in a couple of instances. And I thought it was an interesting read. I agree with some, but I didn't agree with all of it. So that was my one sentence summary of Epic Pooh. Do
Yeah.
you when did you read it last?
Oh, it's been a few years, and
Yeah.
I wish I'd had time to read it before we got on the air here. But it's certainly saying that it's reactionary in terms of monarchism too, if I remember correctly. Was that part of it?
I don't recall the monarchism being the main problem. The main problem, and I started to skim it, to be honest, toward the end, so
Hmm.
maybe I skimmed over part of that issue. It was really about the extolling the countryside over cities that he was really concerned about. And also the idea that at the end of the day, we should all get like children, be tucked into our worm jammies and have a cup of tea
Right,
and
right.
be all comfy cozy. That was
Like the
uh,
bear on the Sleepy Time tea box.
exactly. He talked about the fact that even as a young child, he did not like Winnie the Pooh for that reason.
Okay.
I felt like there's a little bit of, I don't know. I think the politics of it really drove his criticism more than the writing, although he talked
Yeah.
about the writing quite a bit. But again, he was mostly just quoting passages and then saying, "See, it's not good writing." I'm not.
It's
I'm
very
not saying it's not.
60s in outlook, in other
Yeah,
words.
yeah. There's
Yeah.
some of that. I mean, even though it was like like I said, it was a late '70s essay, but I mean, clearly it was something that had been burbling around his brain for
Yeah.
quite a while. I was actually a little disappointed. I was hoping there'd be more about why he wrote what he wrote, and that was
Mhm.
not as evident as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I remember it being a little bit of a screed.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a fair
and
description.
certainly what he wrote in not just in the Elric series, but in the other fantasy series that he did, they do not resemble Lord of the Rings very
No,
much. There are
no.
very few similarities. I mean, there are quests, but
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean that's almost like saying it has a plot.
right, right, right.
But like for example, in the Elric series, I mentioned monarchism. I don't think there are any good monarchs. I probably somebody who is has a codex of Moorcock knowledge in their heads more than mine uh, will 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 correct me on this, but I think either they were all deposed or they were bastards or
No, that's true. I
there
mean,
was no Aragorn
right.
in the Elric
Although,
series. Or he's all over the place. He meets all people in
right.
all walks of life, all over the Young Kingdom's world, and none of them, I think, stand out in my mind as being a particularly great monarch, which is such a trope of fantasy.
No, that is true. Although I mean, we may be getting ahead of ourselves at this point, but I mean, Elric is ultimately messianic in a certain sense. He is fated to do a certain thing that is very, very important.
But it's more like the Norse idea of fate.
That's fair. I mean, it's a
It's a
doom.
dark
Yeah,
fate.
it's a dark
He's
fate.
in the most superficial way, I think he's a chosen one, but
Yes.
it's a very dark destiny he has ahead of him. And he without giving anything away, there are not a lot of happy endings in this
No,
series.
there are not.
Yeah, they're satisfying endings for me at least.
Sure.
We'll get to how you
Yeah,
felt
yeah.
about it, but when we talk about the last book in the series. So anyway, other things I just want to mention. He was in a band, Hawkwind, the band I mentioned earlier. He would contribute regularly with them, and as I said, some of the songs that they wrote were explicitly about either the Elric series or some other books that he read, or they were certainly in that sort of vibe that they wanted to recreate in the song. Um, and he was an extremely productive writer. Like, he was one of these people who could like crank out a book in a week. He just would kind of go into berserker mode as a writer and just like plow through writing some of his books. He has a lot of influence on modern fantasy in a lot of different guises. So different ideas that he came up with, for example, the clash between law and chaos, and even like the symbol of chaos, the chaos star shows up in D&D,
Hmm.
the Warhammer and Warhammer 40K franchises, other places. the idea of there needing to be sort of a balancing mechanism between law and chaos as a little bit of a fantasy trope. That's certainly something that came out of the Elric series. I think as a writer of anti-heroes, not merely like lovable rogues, but just like an incredibly troubled person
Right.
came from him, and we'll describe him in a moment. And also the multiverse. He invented the word multiverse. And boy, do people today in the billions now know the word multiverse,
Yes, they do. Yes,
thanks
they
to
do.
the MCU especially. Um, the books that he wrote that were in this series that I read at the time, he added other books later, and this was the reading list I recommended to you were Elric of Melniboné, Sailors on the Seas of Fate, the Sea of Fate, The Weird of the White Wolf, The Vanishing Tower, Bane of the Black Sword, and Stormbringer. And
Yes.
as we said, there are a mix of these short stories, but also elements that plug into a longer narrative. Like the first book in the series is really not a collection of short stories. It is a novel with a start and a finish to it. He didn't write all these in order uh, that they appear in the timeline for Elric. In fact, he wrote the last book in this timeline, Stormbringer, before he wrote the first book, Elric of Melniboné, or Melnibone. Um, I'm going to drive my truck to Melnibone. Um, I don't know why I had a Texas twang in my head when you said that. Um,
He was from Texas, though he wasn't very twangy.
okay. As I said, he added things to it. There's even crossovers within the Elric stories with the
Hmm.
other fantasy uh, series that he wrote. And even with the End of Time series that he wrote, like at the end of the world in this one science fiction setting, there are these people who are living this incredibly decadent and bored lives, and they have like super science at their disposal that basically lets them do anything, but they have no idea what it is that's going to overcome their ennui at the end of time. And there's an Elric book where Elric gets transported into the end of time. So he loved doing this, kind of mixing up all the different kinds of stories that he wrote. The other books that he wrote in the Eternal Champion series, the Eternal Champion is this figure that in Moorcock's multiverse, there's always in any one of these universes an eternal champion, somebody who's there to kind of keep things on track in terms of balance between law and chaos. That person is in different guises at different times. So there's the Hawkmoon series, the Dorian Hawkmoon series, really interesting series. So that's set in the future again. It's not so much science as science fantasy, where in the far future, in Europe, Britain has turned into this monstrous totalitarian state run by sadists and monsters, the Empire of Grand Britain, and the hero in the Hawkmoon series, Dorian Hawkmoon, is somebody who's kind of fighting an insurgent battle against the kind of rolling colossus of Grand Britain as it tries to take over the world. Corum, which also like kind of mixes the rules a little bit of how chaos works. Like in every one of these worlds, the kind of the I don't say physical laws, the metaphysical laws of law and chaos operate a little differently, and so he's up against chaos, but also in a somewhat different way. Um, he's also not, somebody who is, um, shall we say, a Conan.
Hmm.
um, He's somebody who's been mutilated and had an artifact grafted onto his eye and onto his hand that lets him do heroic things. There's Ericos, a guy who knows that he is the Eternal Champion. All these other characters don't know that they're the Eternal Champion.
Yeah.
The Ericos does know, and he remembers his lives as these other incarnations of the Eternal Champion in other universes. And then there's even one in a sort of near future science fiction series, Jerry Cornelius, which Moorcock makes clear that Jerry Cornelius is also in his puffy 60s shirt and, sort of super cool attitude, is also an avatar of the Eternal Champion.
And some of those do show up in these stories, and
Yes.
although not Jerry Cornelius to my recollection.
No, not Jerry Cornelius. But there are these crossover moments when,
Yes,
the something beyond the scope of just one universe needs to be addressed.
right.
And then Moorcock says, okay, we'll just have Coram and Hawkmoon and Ericos and Elric all do a
Yes.
team up. How did you like that? What did you think of that?
No, I thought it was really interesting, and again, this is so I think a theme that I'm going to come back to multiple times is I thought it was really cool, and I wanted more of it explained or more of it developed, not explained necessarily, but developed than I got.
Hmm.
That was an ongoing feeling that I had. I would rather have learned more about the Eternal Champion concept than maybe some of the side quests that we end up going on in some of the short stories. That's
Okay.
just, but I mean, so and I don't, again, I want to stress, I enjoyed reading this and I'm glad I read it and I want to read more of it. So I'm not like down on it, but that was an ongoing feeling that I had. I really wanted to understand better what it was going on. I don't think he's very good at world building. And I've expressed before on this podcast, that's something that I really, really like. And I just don't know that it's as evident as I would like it to have been in these stories.
Well, let's put a pin in that and come back.
Sure.
So let's describe who Elric is. We talked around the issue completely, so let's dive right into it. So Elric begins the series as the Emperor of Melniboné,
Yes.
which is an island in the center of the big ocean of the young, the young kingdom's world. And at one time, Melniboné was the kind of the hegemon of the young
Yes.
kingdom's world. And the reason it's called the young kingdoms is that um, that Melniboné kind of lapsed into decadence and lassitude. They slowly lost their empire, and that these new kingdoms, the young kingdoms, popped up, gained their independence. And while Melniboné is still a power you don't want to mess with,
Right.
it's not exerting the influence over the world that it once did.
Well, so the Melnibonéans were sorcerers. They had dragons,
Hmm.
but the dragons are waning, and something that reminded me of George R. R. Martin's version of all this. That dragons exist, but they're not quite what they used to be. But when you had them,
Yeah.
boy, you could rule the world.
Possible influence of Moorcock there.
Oh, absolutely. No, no.
Yeah.
I think you can't not read. That's a terrible sentence. Let me start again. You can't read the first novel, Elric of Melniboné, and not see echoes of a lot of what George R. R. Martin creates in A Song of Ice and Fire. So I think that's a clear influence. So and there are multiple influences that are rather evident. You've already named some of them. So I think it is worth reiterating that this was clearly an influential bit of literature in that sense.
Right. The Melnibonéans are not human. They're
Right.
humanoid, but they're more like elves, really.
Well, yeah, and that
Um,
was again one of the as I interrupt you, but that was one of the things that it's clear that they're men, but they're not men. This is kind of the way it gets discussed, and maybe there's some kind of intermediary um, entity between the Lords of Chaos and the Lords of Law and human beings. Although he can't quite make, in my opinion, he can't quite make up his mind about this
yeah.
because he does sometimes describe them as men and then other times says they're not men or they're kind of like men. It's all like he hasn't, in my opinion, like especially given the sort of the short story version of it, and sort of again maybe partially his. Quite frankly, I think your description of his maybe being this manic writer that just pours this stuff out
Hmm.
may explain part of my frustration. That I think if you're going to
Hmm.
write that fast, it's harder to be consistent over time. And I think that somewhat was reflected in this issue, for example, is one of those issues. I
Okay.
thought, but maybe it's not important, but it just I noted it.
Yeah. So Elric himself is an albino, as we alluded to at
Yes.
the beginning, and he is sickly,
Hmm.
and he's almost like a joke to the other Melnibonéans. The
Right.
Melnibonéans are a nasty people culturally.
Yes.
Whatever they are biologically, culturally, they're really terrible people.
Yes.
They enjoy things like excessive drug use, torture, That's all very acceptable in Melniboné society. But someone like Elric, who's not only sickly but has scruples,
Yes.
is considered really just weird.
Yeah, he's a giant weirdo.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he doesn't want to like the one thing that sticks in my mind that so illustrates this point is there was a Melnibonéan tradition that when you got married, you had to kill a certain number of lords and ladies or something.
Mhm.
And if you did, and I guess if you didn't do that, that's part of. I guess his father didn't do it. Somebody didn't do it, and this like was part of why they thought they were in decline, and
Right.
whether Elric would bring this tradition back. They're slavers. Yeah, and the whole idea that they don't really have consciences, really, they don't really feel, and that's, and again, this is a thing that I thought was really fascinating. One of my favorite of all the stories that I read, the first one was one of my favorites, and I really wanted to know more about why was this guy different
Hmm.
than his kinsman, and why did he, and I was kind of hoping that when he went into the Young Kingdoms, that he would be learning more about himself and why he thought these ways, instead of just sort of being a characteristic that he sometimes kind of emerges and sometimes it's less important. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's they are speaking of when you said he's the anti-Tolkien. I mean, yeah, these are kind of like elves, but man, they are not creatures of beauty and peace. They are nasty, nasty
Right.
people. Yes,
But they've retreated from the rest of the world. There's
yes,
a huge, if you want to get into Melniboné from the ocean,
hmm,
you have to go through this huge maze.
yes,
So they're able to effectively defend themselves against any attackers,
yes.
unless there's a traitor.
That's right.
Um, so Elric is in love with his cousin Cimmeril or
Hmm.
Kimmeril. He has a really even nastier than normal other cousin Irkun,
Hmm.
who's really thinks that he doesn't deserve to be sitting on the ruby throne of Melniboné and wants to oust Elric.
Right.
And in the course of the first book, he becomes uh, bonded to the rune sword Stormbringer.
Hmm.
And so the Melbourneans are the best sorcerers in the world.
Hmm.
Magic in this setting is tied to the gods of chaos.
Right.
So they're the gods of chaos are their patrons, and because of chaos, Elric gets this chaos sword, and it has a very interesting destiny of its own
Hmm.
that we find out over the course of the Elric series. But anyway, the sword gives Elric more vitality than he would normally have. He is
Right.
not as dependent on his herbs and poultices and so forth. But it does it by sucking the souls out of people it kills,
Right.
which often include, because the sword has a mind of its own,
Hmm.
people who are Elric's friends. Like all of a
Right.
sudden, the sword might lash out at one of them in battle and kill somebody that wasn't
Yes.
Elric's intended target.
Correct. Happy times.
Happy times. So this is about as opposite from Frodo and Sam
Oh,
as you
sure.
can possibly get.
That's right.
Eventually, without giving too much away in the series, Elric isn't emperor anymore. Um, in fact, he's I don't want to give anything away here, but kind of helps along the decline of Melniboné. I'll
Right.
just
Right.
say
Right.
that.
Sure.
Um, and he then wanders the world with Stormbringer. You mentioned Moonglum before
Hmm.
in our intro. Moonglum becomes his faithful companion and goes off on a series of adventures that eventually lead to the final book, and all the threads of the great destiny of Elric and Stormbringer come together.
Right. Right. Right.
Anything to add to
And
that description of the series?
no, I think what I would say is this. So, I mean, it is, as we've described, it is a character-focused series specifically around Elric and the various people in his orbit. It is it is sword and sorcery of a type with its own unique elements. Most of it, I would say this. I mean, if you're interested in reading this, you like fantasy. In some ways, it's like comic books or TV series, right? There's a central character, there's a general world, and we go through a series of adventures with these people. That's
Hmm.
with this thread of an overarching story that is like with the Star Trek series you mentioned, not as episodic as modern television, is, or as episodic maybe as modern fantasy is, but it's in the background and eventually gets paid off. So it's each individual story. I mean, like, for example, I'll say this, and it only made sense to me fully after I read everything. But you told me at one point you don't have to read all the stories as long as you read the first one and the last one and maybe some in the middle.
Yeah.
And I was stubborn and I read all six of them because I was going to read all six of them, which is fine. But I understand now why you say you could have skipped some of these stories and just read Stormbringer. That's entirely possible. I guess in the same way you could watch the last season of DS9 and skip some of the filler stories and just watch the ones that are about the Dominion War and been
Right.
fine, right? So, so in that sense, it has that sort of character to it. And I would recommend it if you like this kind of stuff, especially if you like, again, the D&D of it all really just continued to roll around in my head. It really felt kind of like that to a degree, or at least a certain kind of manifestation of it. And it did remind me of, to a degree, Conan or the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, or some others again that I can't quite conjure, but things that I read when I was younger.
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit on the D&D analogy because
Okay.
I think it's more just basic kind of fantasy short story structure. You
Hmm.
have a setup. This woman finds Elric in a tavern,
Hmm.
and she needs to find the dead god's book.
Hmm.
And Elric really would also like to find the dead god's book. And so they form a partnership. They go through various travails, and at the end, they find the dead god's book. There's sort of a twist ending in that particular story. But that just means there's closure on what's effectively a short story that you could
Right.
stick in a magazine.
I mean, I guess I'll push back on your pushback because we're
Oh,
all, but
okay.
doesn't that sound like a D&D module to you?
I think that's a little bit of a superficial
Well, I
resemblance. I
understand
mean,
that
and
I'm
that you
saying
have to
that,
fight a big bad at the end. Yeah, okay, I'll agree with that. That
well,
there's a
no,
big bad often that has to be
understand
defeated.
that I'm not saying that Moorcock is aping D&D. I'm saying that D&D is aping Moorcock.
Okay, okay.
So I'm not saying that this is like, but again, I mean, to me, again, and I said something a second ago that I'll clarify. I said, I guess it depends on how you play D&D, but the basic structure of dude in tavern encounters random person who has a quest that they have a mutually agreeable outcome that they would like to reach, and they engage in a series of adventures to reach that conclusion. That sounds to me like a typical D&D game. That's what I'm saying. Now, I think that as you pointed out, when we talked about Dungeons and Dragons in the previous podcast several weeks ago, we noted how like in the what was it called, deities and demigods, and they stole all this
Hmm.
Elric stuff and
Right.
put it in the book. What I'm pointing out is that I think a lot, and you even said at the time, E. Gary Gygax was influenced by Michael Moorcock. That's what I'm saying,
Oh, okay.
and so I'm saying that
Well,
if you,
so I guess I'm not worried about that. I'm a little just more worried that D&D modules are a little bit railroaded. You say D&D module, and that is,
right,
like you buy the D&D module,
right,
you play it as a group, and you
right,
expect to go through all the antagonists, whether they're monsters or
right,
cultists or vampires or God knows whoever else it is, a lich, and
right,
then you successfully reach the end. The that particular big boss has been defeated,
right.
and then you move on to the next module. I don't think all of the Elric stories are like that. So like the one with the sort of the ancient Melnibonéan guy
Mm-hmm.
who is obsessed with the woman, and
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that didn't follow that structure. And
No, okay. So I'll say one thing that we can move on, or we can keep talking about if you like. I think that there are certainly stories that don't fit exactly what I just described. But
mhm.
my experience of reading these six novels, or these six, whatever you want to call them, mostly collections of short stories, and felt even part of Stormbringer felt that way to me, which is a more of
Mm.
a narrative. That's the way I consumed. This is the way it felt to me. That we were basically start. I don't want to describe it again. That's how it felt to me. So that's and except that I would agree that it's in a broader. There's a broader universe that's a little more coherent, and there is an overarching story. I totally agree with that. I'm not trying to denigrate it by this description. I'm just telling you this is how it felt to me when I read it. How
Okay,
about
fair
that? How
enough.
about that?
Okay. Okay. But what did you like? I mean,
Oh
when you
no,
read
so
these,
there's
so
plenty that I
what were the
liked.
parts that you liked?
So like I said, I found the Melnibonéans fascinating, and
Hmm.
again, I found the sort of the generic history of the world very interesting. I found the whole struggle between law and chaos to be of interest. I certainly found the Eternal Champion concept, which I think I would need to read more things to fully grasp, of interest. The multiversalness of it all, the different sort of Lords of Chaos, in particular, the Dukes of Hell, which sounds like a rock band.
Hmm.
And to some degree, the other sort of characters that emerge, like the Lords of Law, the White Lords, whatever their name
Hmm.
was, the Gray Lords, and there were specific places that I found interesting. Imrir was interesting. Tanlor was interesting. Natsokor, which is this kingdom of beggars, was interesting.
Hmm.
I wanted to know a lot more about Pantang than I were revealed. But again, with all of these things that I found were very interesting. So we have, but I wanted to know so much more about them. And maybe it's not really a critique as much as, dude, you really gave me some interesting things. I just really wanted a deeper understanding of what was going on. I thought we were going to go to Pantang, for example, at some point. We never did, if I recall properly. So I Elric's internal struggle is interesting. I find the sort of weakness part of his character interesting, and then having to sort of find vitality through either through his potions and whatnot, or through the sword is interesting. Certainly the the two swords, Stormbringer and Mournblade, are interesting. I find the conflict with his cousin was interesting. I really wanted more of the internal
Hmm.
conflict in Melniboné than I got. I mean, those are all things that I liked.
Okay. So I'll tell you what I loved about these books when I
Please.
first read them. So they were startlingly original.
Sure.
I think just like not anything I had read as a young geek, having read Tolkien and other
Right.
things.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I really liked the flawed protagonist.
Hmm.
It wasn't merely that Elric was physically weak, but he was also capable of making some pretty bad choices at times, and also
Yes.
like he was fighting his fate constantly. Like at one
Hmm.
point, he just kind of hangs Stormbringer up in a wall and said, "Nope, not going to do this anymore."
Right.
And of course, that doesn't last. I thought that the interesting thing that we're the interesting doom of Elric and the world that they keep talking about was still suspenseful because you didn't know what that meant.
Right.
You know, what exactly is going to happen at the end of the series? And it surprised me. It was not what I had expected. Um, I think that Moorcock, in that sense, had a willingness to see things through, that he would set something up and not back away from it. You know, that if he's, kind of had somebody as troubled as Elric is, like he didn't, whatever it would be, like go to therapy or,
Right. All right.
or, just find a good woman, which he kind of did. And then,
Right.
all these things that, okay, well, if you say that he is living under this doom, then see it through, man,
Right.
and yeah, and that was true of a lot of the stories too that came to, I think, the logical conclusion. I never felt like Moorcock cheated. And I sometimes feel like people in fantasy and science fiction will cheat a little bit to come up with a more comfortable ending. And that goes back to epic poo, right?
Right.
That people want comfort. And I didn't feel comfortable with everything that happened in the
Hmm.
Elric series, and that was
Right.
fine. That was
Right. No,
absolutely
that's fair.
yeah, and the cosmic elements of it, like you and me, we both like cosmic superheroes.
Yes. Yes.
Like Captain Marvel and Warlock, who is clearly also influenced
Yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely.
by Elric. And this is the ultimate cosmic in terms of
Yes.
fantasy, right? It's not just the young kingdoms; it's the universe that occupies and all the other universes, and that was pretty fun in a mind blowing way.
No, are we to the point now? I think we've not been totally clear. We're going to spoil things now. I know we've been kind of dancing around it.
Well, let me just ask before we get into the spoilers. You said you compared this to D&D. Is there anybody else you'd compare this to? Because I
Well,
can't
like I
think of
said,
anybody.
and I haven't. I think again. I think yes and no. Right. One, as I noted, it does remind me of other sword and sorcery stuff in terms of its basic structure.
Hmm.
I agree wholeheartedly that the nature of the character is unlike anything that I can think of in fantasy literature. Um, and I did enjoy the fact that it did come to a specific conclusion. I agree that he saw through what he intended to see through as a writer. Um, but I can't think of any other kind of comp beyond the ones that we've mentioned.
Okay. So let me ask you a question. Since it sounds like one of the biggest things that was a little bit of a downer for you was the lack of world building.
Hmm.
So here's a counter hypothesis.
Okay.
There are lots of things that we enjoy that have implied settings.
Hmm.
Like we did never really got that much depth about the Klingon Empire in the original Star Trek series. It was just sort of there.
Hmm.
And even like in Next Generation, we saw, like, bits and pieces over time, but it never was completely fleshed out. Or Star Wars, like you saw the first Star Wars movie, it was a great space opera.
Hmm.
Two other movies came out in the series. You never really found out a lot about the settings, maybe about the Jedi a little bit, but not a ton. Close Encounters of the Kind, that has somebody stumble into a situation that they don't fully understand, and by the end, like we don't even really understand who the French guy is. We don't understand a lot about the aliens. So for me, I'm comfortable with that.
Hmm.
So what is it about world building to you that's missing from this that would have been added to your enjoyment?
So, well, maybe again, I think it's entirely possible that, and again, I find this sort of very interesting. I don't have the capacity to maybe fully analyze why it is the case in any kind of systematic way. But I just really think that one of the things about this podcast that I found really interesting is thinking about how you and I have encountered particular bits of genre and how that may or may not influence how we read it. So again, I'm a 57-year-old man reading this for the first time, and I've read God knows how many books over the years. So it's entirely possible that my brain has been programmed in a certain way.
Mm,
That if we
okay.
start off a story with a sad king on a ruby throne who is different than all of his kinsmen in some very specific way, that I'm going to understand more about why that's the case. Maybe I'm more interested in characters than I was when I was 13, or maybe I'm just been programmed from other things that I've read that I should expect to know more than is revealed, and also to assume that if you're going to set up a character who has his problems and decides he's going to go out into the wider world to understand things, that will lead to more understanding. Now, as a stepping away from all of it, I do, and now that I've read it all and I've done some more research, because I tried to avoid any kind of spoilers, so I didn't read a whole lot. I knew that this was not all written in the same. All I knew was it wasn't written in the chronology of the
Mm,
storytelling. And so it makes sense to me as a writer or someone who's tried to write, although mostly writing, not writing fiction, but I understand that the order in which you do things as a writer means you don't always know what the future holds in terms of what you're going to do with the narrative. So I think part of it is him bookending or writing it out of order created some of this anticipation that I had at least that maybe wouldn't isn't going to play out, because I think the centrality of this character, and I know I maybe the D&D of it all is the wrong way to put it, because it sounds like I'm denigrating, and I'm not. I The core of the story on one level, especially the way he originally wrote it, was really about this character and his quests
right.
and then fulfilling this doom. And even now, I'm forgetting what order. When was Stormbringer written? When was that
That
written?
was one of the first.
But it was after some of these other stories were written.
Yeah, some of the stories, I think The Vanishing Tower was the first thing that he
Yeah,
wrote.
and So he's kind of in some ways he's working out of order, and maybe that creates again some of this and you also write short stories that are going to be published in magazines, often years apart. You write that differently than you write novels or even a coherent long-term story,
Hmm.
right? So I mean, I applaud him for there is a long-term story and there's a thread, and the thread is clear, and the plot is satisfying. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. In some ways, I think I'm rendering a compliment, saying that you've given me something and I want more of it is a
Right.
compliment in my mind. So I'm
Oh,
not
that is
in
okay.
that sense. I'm not like, oh my
Oh, and
God,
I'm
if
not
I
saying you're wrong
no
either.
no no. I just so I mean to go back to something you said, I totally accept the fact. Yeah, you can watch something and you don't have to know everything about it. That's totally fair. And maybe and I do think, and there's no moral judgment one way or the other on what I'm about to say. I think I want it more than you want it, and that's fine.
Hmm.
I think it's always been, again, this examination of this material from this vantage point makes me think about my young self quite a lot. And, again, I was the weirdo that got excited about footnotes in comic books. I mean, that's just, ridiculous. But I was really like, oh, wow, there's more to know about. This is deeply part of my personality that I've thought
Yeah.
about before we did this podcast, but because it does fit into my, the way I look at the world and what my professional life was like. But the podcast makes me really realize how deeply ingrained this is in me. I want to know more. And maybe that's, asking too much of a particular, novel or short story or author. But I did, and it was this part is a criticism. I got a little frustrated beyond setting aside the world building part. And maybe there's another way about the world building does kind of bother me. And I think it is a legitimate critique of the way he writes. Aside from the ones that I named, like Tantalorn clearly has something specific about it.
Hmm.
Uh, Nad Silkor has something specific about it. For the most part, I felt like the locations were largely interchangeable.
Yeah.
It was just names on the page.
Fair. I think it's totally fair.
And like a lot of writers of this type, in that and look, I tried to write fiction a long time ago. And I remember just, you were like, well, because a lot of what I read like this, right? You just make up names as you go. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to really know what
Hmm.
they mean. And that's kind of what it feels like sometimes, like there has to be a place, so we rename it. And I also felt like the characters were often, not entirely, but often very interchangeable. I didn't feel like, for example, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget because I cannot remember all these names. But like, I didn't feel like, oh, Theleb, whatever his name was. Where did my notes
Thalib
go?
Karna.
Theleb Karna and Jigrin Learn, they were totally interchangeable to me.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
often the bad guys at the end of the quest were not. Sometimes they were very different. Like, the sad giant was different, or my favorite is Roland. But anyway, but even the companions were not radically different. I mean, Rakir had a bow, and Moonglum had a sword, and it often didn't
Right.
feel that different to me.
And that would be, by the way, uh,
Yeah.
my biggest critique of these is that the characters beyond Elric
Yes.
are often pretty thin.
So I think when I say world building, it's part of what I mean.
Hmm.
Some like there's Melniboné has some very distinct things about it, and I just wanted to know more about it. But I'm not sure that many of the other places did. Even Tantalorn has this sort of mythical role it plays, but I don't know that I have any sense of place. And the only thing that really, and I bring up, I keep looking at my notes. Natsakor is only interesting because it's where all these beggars live. That's the only thing about it that I remember, and I think it really is the only thing about it that distinguishes it.
Hmm.
So, and the characters also. So, I mean, there's a certain shallowness, I guess, in terms of people and places apart from Elric, and to some degree apart from El Nibide.
Right.
That's, I guess, maybe what I'm getting at. Not that I have to have, you know, a Tolkien-esque, the language of the Melnibonéans or whatever, glossary at the end of the book or whatever. But
Yeah. So what I was going to say is I think you're not wrong at all, and I think that what we're really touching on is a question of taste.
yeah, it is.
I think there are people I would recommend reading Tolkien to.
Hmm.
and they'd be all in on everything, including Tom Bombadil and the endless Elvish songs and the appendices with the different, like the runic language of the dwarves and so forth. They would eat that up. And
Hmm.
there are other people who would say, I wish these elves would stop singing already,
Sure, of
and
course.
we could get on with the
Right.
plot. And Moorcock is really just a guy who wants to move the plot along.
Hmm.
And maybe he does it a little bit in excess sometimes, kind of, as you said, some missed opportunities to flesh things out a little more.
Hmm.
But it makes it also easy to like drop into the middle of the
Yeah, it
series.
does.
Because
That's
I didn't think I read Elric of Melniboné first, even though it was the first book. And you didn't need a lot of background to kind of get
no.
into. And by the way, it was the Dreaming City that was the first published story. So
Okay.
if you read the Dreaming City, you had all you needed to know in order to enjoy
Right.
that.
Right. No, I think that's fair. And that's why I said earlier, and I would liken it kind of to a TV series or a comic book of the
Hmm.
type that in the sort of so pre-contemporary TV, where you didn't really have to watch things in order. You could
Right.
figure it out, and that's fine. But it is a particular, and again, it may partially simply be, well, one, I've developed a particular set of tastes over a half century,
Yeah.
and also you do get kind of programmed by what you consume, whether you want to admit it or not, right? So
Hmm.
that's maybe part of it, what I'm reacting to. And again, I'll repeat myself. I do think it's rather fascinating to think about how, time and age and experience does influence the way in which you encounter all this stuff. It just is essentially the case. It's a deep theme of the
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah, and I would say the other strength of all of this, and that he had this sort of modular approach to writing the Elric series, drop in a story here, drop in another
Hmm.
story there. I think one of the chief advantages of that is you're not writing a very detailed, dense sort of fantasy epic where not only might the reader poop out after a while,
Hmm.
but in George R. R. Martin-esque
Hmm.
fashion,
Hmm.
you might poop out after a while. And even if you finish it, right, a lot of the later books might be pretty weak because
Oh
you just
no,
like want to fulfill the contractual obligation and get out.
or not. But yeah, I look. I will then sort of from the flip side, as much as I felt like the Game of Thrones novels does a better job of fleshing out, and Martin clearly understands his history of his people more
Yeah.
than Moorcock ever did or does. But yeah, I mean, at some point, I'd rather have the damn thing finished
Yes.
than and have there be a completion to the story than to have it float off into obscurity because I've mentioned the Wheel of Time before. I liked the Wheel of Time series, but it was too damn long and often was clearly this need to keep producing books because the books sold than simply to move the plot along. So in that sense, sure. I mean, there's plenty to like about this. And there is a balance, I guess, and it's difficult to know what the balance is between law and chaos over how much how much is too much world building and how much and detail and how much is not enough. And again, as you point out, I think correctly, it is largely a matter of taste in some ways, so or in all ways. But anyway, we can move on from this, I guess, unless I've left you something you wanted to comment on.
No, no, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. All right. So from here on, we're getting into spoiler territory because we're going to talk about the last book.
Yes.
All right. So just give people an opportunity to switch us off or skip ahead a bit. Um, so the last book, The World Ends,
The world ends, and yeah. So
but a new world
a
begins.
new world begins. Yes.
And that really blew me away when I read that. It's just like, again, I said I was in suspense. Like, how's it going to happen? How's it going to happen? It's like, okay, now we're being told that the new world that's being created, that where law and chaos are out of whack the way that they were in the Elric series is our world?
Yeah,
Huh?
that was the implication that I took from it as well.
Yeah.
There was, and I will say this, and this it really would have I would have been especially satisfied had I read that when I was 12, because it was often the case that there was in a lot of fantasy that we read, as I recall, often it's sort of weird implication that maybe the world you're reading about is also just some past version of our world, but it was often never fully.
Oh yeah. Well, Conan clearly was that.
Yeah,
It was an antediluvian
right.
world that we didn't have apparently any archaeological record of, but it was
Exactly. Which
predated our world.
so the way this works out, where it really does wipe out one world which is full of magic, and then creates a world where there's barely any magic because of the whole chaos thing, I thought was pretty cool. I liked the sort of the very end of the book. I would say that I liked the way in which chaos engulfs the world. I don't know. In my
Eats it
mind,
up. Yeah.
it was all kind of Cthulhuoid. I don't know if that's just what my
Oh,
brain
definitely.
conjured, but you know, and disturbing and gross, like when Zorazinia becomes a worm.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
awful.
That's
Eric,
Elric's current love interest,
his wife, in
Eric.
fact,
Yes, his wife.
his only wife, if I
Right.
recall.
And by swallowing up the world, chaos is warping everything.
Yes, everything. Yeah.
Yes.
So that was cool, and this sort of vision of an ever shrinking zone of survivability, basically.
Yeah.
Very apocalyptic definitionally. And I thought that was very well done. I was struck. So, well, I have some things to say about the novel as a whole, but let me. What else about this do you want to talk about before I derail us?
Well, there are other things I don't want to give away too much in case somebody did decide to listen to this, even if they haven't read the
Right.
Stormbringer. But like what we find out about the two swords,
Hmm.
in that one resolution of one of the quarters of the book. That was unexpected and really cool. I mean, there's this
Hmm.
sort of like a really powerful rule of cool in the Elric books. Like if something seemed cool, like, oh, I'm going to come up with a monster, but it's not just going to be again like
Hmm.
a goblin, right? It's going to be this weird shape-shifting creature, or it's going to be these lizard-like predecessors of the Melnibonéans, or anyway, they're just like odd, off the wall sorts of
No,
things.
there
Yeah.
is no doubt that he is a highly imaginative person,
Yeah.
and does provide a lot of truly mind-blowing notions and ideas.
Yeah.
And I think again, I think I would have been more blown away reading it at 12 than I was now, because I think, as I've described before, and I can't really necessarily give an exact comp, but as we've discussed online, probably and offline as well, I think sometimes reading these things, you've had so many other things you've encountered, it dilutes the originality, because some of the stuff does, as we've already mentioned, right? Law and Chaos. It's in Zelazny. It's in Babylon 5. It's in
Right.
a whole bunch of different things. The multiverse thing is all over the place. So sometimes I think it's difficult. Well, my main comp on this is, like, I read Tarzan, some of the Tarzan stuff early, the original stuff, and in high school, and I remember thinking, this is kind of cliche. Until I realized, yeah, it's cliche because everyone's copied this over and over and over again. This was the original, right?
Right.
This is, and I'm gotten so used to, the echo of the sound. I'm not realizing that the original sound is what really matters, right? And to respect it for what it is. So I think in some ways, maybe the lack of being as wowed as I might have been at some point in my life is because I have encountered all these things in so many different contexts.
Yeah.
That therefore he doesn't necessarily get his due the way he would if I'd originally encountered it. So there's that, and there was the reason for going down that pathway that my brain is now totally
Oh,
destroyed. But
that's
anyway,
okay. It'll come back to you.
yeah,
Can I
yeah. But
just jump in with
no,
another
jump
thing
right
about
in.
Law and Chaos? I think was really good.
Sure.
So I remember enjoying this a lot when I first read the book. It was when Elric goes to the plane of law,
Hmm.
and we've been kind of like set up as like chaos is bad, right? Chaos is swallowing up the world, warping everything. The Chaos Lords are really evil.
Yes.
Going to the plane of law, their opposition, it was this arid place,
Yes.
this, completely unimaginative,
Yes.
uh, whatever you want to call it, universe or sub-universe or something. Anyway, so it really, I thought in that moment he made the case very effectively for within his own setting about the need for the balance between law and chaos.
Yes.
Yeah, but
No,
the law couldn't win either, really. Yeah.
right. That's right. Um, Here's a question. Did you, because as I'm thinking through this, did you read these stories before or after you started playing Dungeons and Dragons? I know I keep coming back to that theme, but there's a reason why.
Oh, I don't know. I'll tell you what. I've never been a fan of alignment in D&D. Um,
Okay.
yeah, but I do not recall.
So part of why, so again, I'm trying to get into my head, what is it that, when I say the echo of the original sound, I think part of why I keep making this D&D comp is because it so clearly influences Dungeons and Dragons, but I encountered Dungeons and Dragons first.
Oh, by decades.
Yeah. So, but I encountered D&D first, and I encountered that kind of storytelling many, many, many decades ago. And now I'm reading this. And so part of, I think, the reason I overlay some of these things in my head is because that's just a framework that's already been
Yeah,
established. And
interesting.
in some ways, it's not fair to Moorcock to keep saying this D&D stuff because he precedes it, right?
Hmm.
But it is, again, that, and I know that it's not like the questing structure is not one that pre-exists even Moorcock. So it's not like this is entirely unique to him. But I think that, again, I have all this baggage that then filters all this through, and changes the way you view something sort of definitionally. But anyway,
Okay. All right. Interesting that we did this episode right after doing Crisis on Infinite Earths,
yes,
another multi-universe setting. In that case, it's not just one universe, but all the universes that are experience the apocalypse.
yes.
Any useful comparisons there, or is that just a happy coincidence?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a coincidence, but yeah, I think it is interesting to note this notion of multiverses and the rebirth of an Earth is just sort of central to all this of both stories. So I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
again, as
rebirth.
you noted, the concept of multiverse originates in the story. So that's, I mean, I'm just curious. Do you know for a fact that he's the first usage of the word multiverse?
I'm pretty sure he is.
It's
I'm pretty
interesting.
sure. Yeah. I mean, there were stories with alternate universes in
Sure.
science fiction, but certainly the term multiverse and to have a sort of a multiversal mythology the way that he did with Law and
Yes.
Chaos and the Eternal Champion and
Hmm.
so forth. I mean, that certainly comes from him. Okay, so let's wrap up. I'm not going to ask the question, what merch did you have? Because you had none other than the
That's
D&D
right.
books. Did you
Right.
like alignment in D&D when you first was playing?
I never really knew how to make that work.
I just did not care one iota from the
Yeah.
moment I bought the white box original D&D books. It's just like, who cares? Like
Right.
this doesn't help.
Right.
I can't touch this because it's lawful and I'm chaotic.
Right. Right. Right.
What an unnecessary mechanic. Um, okay. I I had both the Elric role-playing game from Chaosium,
Okay.
the which is who is for people who don't know, that's a very classic, still in business publisher of role-playing games and other things. That I thought did a great job of recreating Elric. They had taken a system that they developed for a different fantasy setting and then really put in the game mechanics that supported like law, chaos,
Hmm.
demons are a big deal in the Elric
Yeah, but we know who they
world.
rooted for because they're called Chaosium.
That's actually part of that name is because the founder of it, Greg Stafford, lived near the Coliseum in Oakland.
Ah, funny.
Yeah, but the chaos part certainly.
Yeah, sure.
And he actually his invented background also is influenced by Moorcock, that there is chaos in that, and they're also bad.
Hmm.
Um, you don't want to let chaos get out of control is the theme of RuneQuest.
Right.
I also had a board game that Chaosium also came out with, and there was a reprinting that was done by Avalon Hill that you played the cosmic battle, and Elric would wander around the world as your faction was one of the Young Kingdoms, and its allies would occasionally get him as a super powerful ally, but then he would lose it, and Stormbringer would kill somebody who's one of your leaders, and then he'd disappear and pop up someplace else random on the board. It was kind of fun.
It's just a giant pain in the ass.
I know. I think it really is a game mostly for people who enjoy this series.
Sure.
It's not necessarily the best fantasy war game out there. Is there anything now that you wish you had in tangible form from
So, I mean, I
these
think
books?
I decided that I'm interested in, again, reading more books set in this universe, and I'm interested in some of the comics.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
Well, the stuff that P. Craig Russell drew, adapting these stories, those are really good.
excellent.
So when I was a youngster, remember it was a thing when we were young that you would get these like replica swords you could put on a wall.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, and sometimes there was a shield.
Oh,
So
yes.
we had one of those, and there was a black iron sword. And I, of course, took
Of
it
course.
and painted with like miniatures paint on it runes,
Of course.
which was pretty lame. So I wish I'd had a better Stormbringer than the one that I homebrewed like that.
Fair enough.
That would have been great. I don't want that now. I don't want that hanging on my wall.
No, no.
Yeah.
Fair enough, though.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good place to wrap up our walk through the Young Kingdoms and the Elric series. So I want to thank everybody for listening.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for listening. And I want to be clear. I enjoyed reading these books. I would recommend reading these books. It's just, I had things that I had thoughts, but that's
Yeah.
the whole point of the
I didn't
podcast.
mean to say that it was a perfect series by any stretch of the
No, I
imagination.
did not interpret that at all.
Yeah.
It was fun. Always fun talking to.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Time for us to get out of here before the waves of chaos consume the world. So before we go, thanks again for listening. Please like and subscribe. And by all means, leave a review on the podcast app of your choice. If you want to reach out to us directly, drop us a line at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. You can also find us on the Ancient Geeks blog on Substack, someancientgeek.substack.com, and we're also on Reddit, Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets. All content copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time. I'm sick.